Hi guys, let's talk about your next paper. This paper is called an example, or sometimes we call it illustration paper, so you may have heard it called one or the other. This comes from chapter 8 in the Back to the Lake textbook, so be sure that you take a look through that chapter. That will be really beneficial to you. So the point of this paper is to make a point by using examples. Typically, you've seen this kind of paper in an academic setting when you've been told to give examples or to cite evidence. So something like give 3 reasons, or give 3 examples, or cite evidence from the text to explain your point. So you've seen this paper many times before. You'll see it a lot in your academic career, so this is one of the most important papers that I teach you because you'll see it very frequently. But the idea is to provide examples or more details to persuade or to explain an idea, which means your purpose could be to persuade, which means then you give us 3 reasons, or to explain, which means you give us 3 examples. So depending on your purpose, also then influences what your paper sounds like whenever you put it together. Now, the reason that we write this paper is because, especially as you know, the reason that a teacher would assign this paper is because we want to make sure that these really big, complex concepts, we want to make sure that you understand them. So when you're asked to give examples or cite evidence, that shows us that you understand the smaller parts of a really big issue. So maybe give 3 examples of bravery in the Battle of Gettysburg, then shows us that you understand some of the specific details of what would otherwise be a really big concept. Or, give 3 places that the author changes tone in the text, cite evidence from the text for this. Shows us that you can find that particular concept in a large work. So it's showing deeper understanding of a larger concept. Okay, that's the idea of example. You've done this before because a lot of times we call this the 5-paragraph essay. You have some sort of introduction. I'm going to write on this so you have some idea. Okay, and then you have either 3 reasons or 3 examples, and then you have your conclusion. So you've done this type of paper before. Again, it's very common. Okay, so just so you know. So let's talk about some pre-writing. What do you need to know about your topic? First of all, you need to consider your audience. Your audience for this paper is going to be us, so your classmates, so make sure it makes sense for your audience, and also your examples need to make sense. Whatever those 3 points you're going to make are, they need to make sense to the people you're speaking to in the class. So make sure you avoid too much jargon or technical terminology that we may not understand. All right, so to come up with the topics, the easiest way to come up with topics for this one are to list. So just what are some things you know a lot about? Maybe I love studying the Civil War. I have a history minor. And so, that could be something I could write a lot about. So listing is really helpful. Or once you come up with a topic, doing some webbing would be really helpful. So if I draw a web of my topic, and then I can give, different points I want to make. If I'm going to prove something, I will give, reasons why this is true. If I want to just explain something, I could give, 3 examples of this. Now, by the way, just so you understand, narrative can be very much a part of example, because maybe the way you give us 3 reasons or 3 examples is you tell us 3 stories. So narrative can very much be a part of an example paper. So I've given you some ideas to write about, just some topic examples here. Feel free to use one of these. You're welcome to them. So a phenomenon in culture that you can think of examples of. So advertising influences, fashion trends. I had a student write about faux pas in male fashion, and then she gave 3 examples of 3 things guys wear that they shouldn't wear. So there's an example for you. Maybe examples of concepts. So love, hate, forgiveness, courage. And then what you would do is give us 3 examples of any of those particular concepts. Examples of events that cause a person to grow up. So those sort of coming of age moments that we all have where we look around and realize, oh man, I'm an adult now. So, what are 3 of those events that have happened in your life, maybe, or happened, just to people in general that make us realize that we've now grown up? Okay. And then number 4, why everyone should blank. And you fill in the blank here, and I've given you a couple of examples. And then in here, you would give us more details. You would give us the 3 reasons why we should do one of those things. Okay. So there's some coming up with topics and doing some detailed planning, doing some paragraph planning. Webbing is a really great way to do that, so I strongly suggest that you spend a little bit of time doing a web. The thesis for this paper needs to show a correct point of view, so no longer are we going to use I unless you're telling us a story, which would be in the body of the paper. You may give us a little bit in the intro or conclusion, maybe because this is something personal, but your thesis really should be more in third person, okay? Make sure it's a very narrow topic, and you give us the so what. So everyone should learn to drive a car because, and then make sure you give us that so what. And it should not be your 3 reasons. Your 3 reasons are not your so what. Okay. Everyone should learn to drive a stick shift because fill in the blank, and then break that down into your 3 points. So make sure that this and your 3 points are not necessarily the same thing. All right. So what can you put in here? What can you put in these different examples that come off of your topic? Well, there are 4 different types of examples you can use. The first is personal experience, so this would be those narratives. So maybe you tell us a story of one thing that happened to you that made you realize you were growing up, and then another thing that happened to you, and then another thing that happened to you. There again is your narrative style. Of course, these will be much shorter than the narrative you wrote for me for the last paper, but that's what you would do here. Typical case could still be narrative, but it's how do we typically see this in society? So just generally, these are some things that happen to us that make us realize that we have grown up. So you don't have to necessarily make it personal. This is called typical case, just how does this typically happen to people. Hypothetical is how something could work in the future, maybe. So I had a student who was studying nuclear power. He was doing nuclear energy and solar energy as his degree. And so he talked about what if we went to doing solar panel roads, I think is his topic. So that's pretty futuristic. We're not really doing that, especially in this area. So he talked about, what were some of the things that could happen, or some of the reasons that we should consider solar-powered roads. Well, of course, he had to speak mostly hypothetically because we're not doing that yet. So that's looking more to the future. The very last one is a special case that may or may not apply to you. And that is, instead of using 3 different examples, you use one example and break it into 3 parts. Now, the reason you would do that is because you have one incredibly powerful example that so overshadows any other examples you could give that it just doesn't make sense to include them. So I'll give you an example of extended example. I had a student write about why we should raise the legal drinking age because one of her best friends had been killed by a drunk driver who was over the legal age but still chose to drink and drive. Well, telling about her experience and what had happened to her with her best friend so overshadows any other examples she could give that it didn't make sense in her paper to then include 2 other examples. So instead, she took that one example of what happened with her friend and broke it into 3 parts to prove her point. All right, so here's where you make your point, is in your thesis, and then in the body you're going to prove your point. Okay, so the key to this paper, and make sure you understand this, the key to this paper is that you're very specific, because you're trying to take a big concept and break it down into smaller pieces. You need to make sure that you're very, very specific in your body examples that you give. All right, don't make this very broad because then you've missed the point of the paper. All right, when you're ready to write, let's talk a little bit about what you need to do when you're ready to actually sit down and write the paper. First of all, you need to decide how you're going to organize your 3 points. Once you've decided on what your 3 points are going to be, then you need to figure out how am I going to organize them. Of course, there are a couple of ways you can do that chronologically. If that makes sense to you, maybe if you talk about, what causes a person to grow up, maybe you can talk about them in the order they tend to happen. That's fine. Spatial works as you move left to right, or top to bottom. That works. Your most simple example to your most complex example. That works really well, which is very similar to emphatic or emphasis order, in that you give your weakest example at the beginning and your strongest example at the end. And you also need to make sure that you use strong transitions here as you move from one example to the next, because this should not look like you're holding 3 random balls in the air. We should be able to see how all 3 balls are working together. We should be able to see how all 3 examples work together to make your point. So be sure that your transitions make it clear the relationship from body paragraph 1 to body paragraph 2, and then from body paragraph 2 to body paragraph 3. Make sure you use these transitions so we see the relationship between those different points. Okay? What I'm really wanting to focus on with this paper is organization. So organization is key to this paper. That's what I want to see. I want to see a strong thesis. I want to see clear topic sentences. I want to see great transitions. And then I'm also looking for very specific details, right? We've been working on this with description and narrative. So those are the 2 key ideas I'm looking for in this paper: organization, and that you're very specific. All right, and that's what I'll grade most heavy on for this particular paper. All right, also there is a fantastic example of what this looks like on page 257. This is in Back to the Lake. It's an Onion article, and just so we're all clear, the Onion is a satire publication. So they're doing this to be satirical, to be funny, to be sarcastic. So let's just make sure we're all clear there. This one is called All 7 Deadly Sins Committed at a Church Bake Sale. It's very funny, but it's also very clearly organized. It has great specific details. So I highly suggest that you take a look at this example, again on page 257. It's not very long, but I think it will be really beneficial for you to see a good example of what this should look like. All right, for brainstorming, I suggest you fill out this bottom part down here, okay? And I've included this worksheet in Blackboard for you as well. But the topic, what is your topic going to be? Then what are your 3 examples or 3 reasons? And then what is the so what you're going to teach us about here? Be sure that you give us a so what, and your so what is not your 3 reasons, okay? Because these are 3 reasons. What do we learn? So I would start with this down here to help you get rolling, and then go work on the paper. If you have any questions, feel free to holler at me. Let me know. Again, take a look at the chapter and also at that sample.